Okay, so I want you to imagine that you set out on a project, and the project is to single-mindedly pursue happiness. That's your project. You are going to set as your one and only goal to pursue your own happiness. And I want you to think about for a second what you would expect to come out of that. And in particular, I want you to think about this question. Maybe let's think about the details. What would you end up doing? What would you try to do with your life if you only wanted to pursue your own happiness? Uh, and at the same time, once you've thought through that, what you would do if you just wanted to make yourself happy? Would you exercise? Would you eat well? Would you eat profligately? Would you go skydiving, do exciting things? Would you try to stay in and do calm things? The answer is probably going to be different for different people. So think through the details, but also think about this bigger question, which is, do you think that after some substantial amount of time doing that, you would actually end up being happy? So that's the question that we're going to deal with here. What we're dealing with in particular is what's called the paradox of hedonism. So it's called the paradox of hedonism. It's supposed to be a problem for hedonism. That is the theory that happiness or pleasure is good, intrinsically good, and it's the only thing that's intrinsically good. Pain is intrinsically bad, and it's the only thing that is intrinsically bad. Okay, so according to the people who advocate for the paradox of hedonism, they think that you're going to fail at this project. That if you set as your one and only game or aim to pursue happiness, to avoid unhappiness, or to pursue pleasure, to avoid pain, you will fail. You will be unhappy. The reason being, it's an empirical fact, they think, that if we set as our aim happiness, we end up being unhappy. In other words, we actually have to aim at things other than our own happiness or our own satisfaction in order to achieve happiness. So that might sound counterintuitive, but I think that it's generally true. So think about the times that you have been most happy in your life. When has it been, right? Has it been a time when you were pursuing your own happiness or pursuing something outside of yourself, right? The times when you have been most satisfied, I would be willing to wager, are times when you had some goal aside from your own happiness. And it may have even had something to do with other people, I would be willing to bet in many cases. So think about, let me give you a few examples. Think about the professional basketball player, for example. Now, you might ask the professional basketball player after a game whether he was happy during the game. Now, I would be willing to bet, first of all, that question is going to throw him off because that's not what he's willing, that's not really what he's expecting to happen question-wise after a game. But if you asked him, he might have to reflect for a few seconds, say, oh, well, yeah, I guess I was happy. And I think the reason he's going to reflect for a few seconds is because during that game, he was not focused on his own happiness. He was focused on winning the game, right? He wasn't focused on having fun, right? You know, that's the dad thing to say. Oh, you shouldn't be trying to win. You should be trying to have fun. Well, no, if you want to have fun, you should probably try to win. Imagine that professional basketball player going out onto the court and just trying at all points to have fun. In fact, not even at the level of his big goals in the game, like winning, but even at the level of the smallest goals within the game, like making a shot, right? Imagine him, he's not actually trying to make the shot because remember, his only goal is to be happy. So he's like, okay, I got to be happy. I got to get out here and be happy. And he's just thinking through it. Will taking the shot make me happy? It's almost like he's thinking too much about it, right? You don't think, will taking the shot make me happy? You actually have to be aiming at making the shot in order to be happy. So the idea here is, I'll make a weird analogy. The claim I'm trying to make is, in order to be happy, you have to aim at something other than your own happiness. And the weird analogy I'm going to make is with the little floaties that you see in your eye, right? So you see something floating around in your field of vision, you know it's something going on with your eye. It's not actually something out there, right? And sometimes you think, first you notice it. You can actually see it, right? And then you say, oh, well, what is that thing? And you start to try to look at it, right? And as you try to look at it, it runs away, right? You can only see it by looking at something else, right? You can only see it by not focusing on it, because when you try to focus on it, it actually runs away from your perspective into the periphery. And similarly, proponents of the paradox of hedonism, objection to hedonism, say, in order to achieve happiness, you have to be aiming at something other than happiness. And that means that in order to achieve happiness, you have to think that there are things other than happiness that are important, right? You can't just say, I'm going to try to make this shot, but it's only because I'm trying to be happy, right? So the basketball player, he's not out there. He's not saying, well, he's not, he's in the huddle, right? They're 2 points down with 4 seconds on the clock. And he's like, okay, we want to be happy, right? Then we got to win this game. That's not what he's doing, right? He's saying, no, we have to win this game. It is an independently important thing, an independently valuable thing that we win this game. Maybe let's talk about one other example from outside the realm of sports. You might be thinking, well, yeah, but winning the game is not really ultimately important. And maybe there's a valid point to that. So let's talk about something that you would really see as ultimately important aside from happiness. And let's talk about parents with their children, maybe. If you really were thinking about your own happiness all the time, here's one respect in which you would definitely fail to be happy. You would never be able to invest in other people. So let's make the broader point is about investing in other people for their own sake. I'm going to take the particular example of investing in your children. When I look at my kids, I'm not thinking, it would be a weird parent who looks at his kids and says, okay, how should I act towards my kids if I want to be most happy? That's one thought too many. If that's your deliberation, even if you end up acting benevolently towards your kids, you're not a good parent. Because a good parent is going to say, how can I make my kids live? How can I have them live good lives? How can I enable them to live good lives? What can I do to help them grow? And if someone came along and said, yeah, that's good, but how is that going to contribute to your happiness? You'd say, well, that's not really what I'm aiming at. I'm aiming at their happiness, at the goodness of their lives. And now it just so happens that when you do that, and again, whether it's kids or friends or parents or whatever, pouring into someone else's life, you will be happier as a result than if you just aimed at your own happiness. That's just true, right? So what that means is that if you were to single-mindedly aim at your own happiness, you would not attain it as well as someone who aimed at something else. In this case, the good of other people. And you can see this when you look at the world and people that you know, and in some cases ourselves, right? I'm not claiming to actually be virtuous in this way. But you look at the world and you see the people who are the most crabby, unhappy people are often the ones seeking after their own happiness first and foremost. And the most blessed, happy, contented people are the people who have put their own happiness aside to pursue the well-being of others. That's just often the case, empirically speaking. Okay, so what do we do with this? What does this mean? Well, I'm telling you, you might have been confused. This is supposed to be an objection to hedonism. And you might be wondering, well, how does that work? Well, I think the way it works is like this. I'll put the argument up in its formal nature in just a second. But I think the way it works is this. The objection goes like this. If hedonism is true, if pleasure is the only good, it turns out that you actually have to think that other things are good in order to live the best life, right? If pleasure is the only good, we just saw that in order to live the most pleasant life, you actually have to think things other than your own pleasure are good. So, excuse me, it's a weird theory that says, well, happiness is the only thing that's good, and therefore you shouldn't aim at happiness, right? That is what the hedonist has to say if they admit this phenomenon of the paradox of hedonism. And I think they should. Many hedonists do admit this. They say, no, it is true that because happiness is the only good, you should aim at things other than happiness. And the objector says, but don't you see how crazy that sounds? That your theory entails that we shouldn't pursue the thing that you say is the only good thing. Your theory entails, let me say that again, your theory entails, if you're a hedonist, that we should not pursue the only thing you say is good. And in fact, we should pursue things that are not good as ends in themselves. Because that's what's happening in the basketball case. That's what's happening in the child case or in the relationship case. You're pursuing other people's goods or winning the game as good, intrinsically good, or good as an end in itself, as I'm using synonymously. But hedonism says the only intrinsic good is pleasure. So hedonism entails that if pleasure is the only intrinsic good, we actually ought to treat other things as intrinsically good that, according to the theory of hedonism, are not intrinsically good. That's a wild theory. Okay, let me show you how I am summarizing this as a formal argument. Here's how I've got it. If happiness is the only thing that directly makes us better off, then it's rational to single-mindedly pursue it. So this is to say, what this first premise is putting into words that I haven't said yet is that the reason hedonism seems weird is that if a theory says that X is the only thing that is good, then it should be reasonable to pursue that thing single-mindedly. So that's a complicated way of saying it. Let me see if I can say that better. If there's only one good thing, then that thing is what you should pursue, right? Regardless of, I'm not committing to any specific theory. This just seems like premise one is a constraint in general on theories of the good life. If your theory says there's only one good thing, then that should be the thing that you pursue. Or in the terms I'm using here, that's the thing it's rational to pursue. But premise two is summarizing what I've been kind of going on about for 10 or 15 minutes now, which is that it doesn't look like it's rational to pursue happiness single-mindedly. Okay, so the conclusion is that hedonism must be false. Okay, so that's the argument. It's kind of a head spinner, right? Let me stop sharing here. It's wild. And if you think about it, the more I'm experiencing this right now, the more you think about it, the more it kind of trips you out, right? But the fundamental problem is just that I summarized there. You can go back in the video if you want to look at that argument. It seems like if you want to have, in general, if you want to have a theory of the good life, you're going to say that something, well, you could be a pluralist about the good life and say multiple things contribute to the good life. Or you could be a monist about the good life and say there's only one thing that contributes to the good life. But so let's just constrain ourselves to monistic theories and say this. It looks like if you say that there's one good thing in life, in this case it's pleasure, it should be reasonable to pursue that thing, right? That's what you say is good, and you should pursue the good things, right? So if pleasure is the good, we should pursue pleasure. We just saw it doesn't make any sense to pursue pleasure alone as an intrinsic good. Your life actually sucks if you do that. In fact, your life sucks even according to hedonism because you have no pleasure in pursuing pleasure. Let's transition and then get out of here. What can the hedonists say in response to this? Well, I think, let me just share my screen with you again, just so you can see this real quick. I think they're going to deny premise one. Like I said, I think they should admit premise two. We shouldn't directly pursue pleasure. And they're just going to say, yeah, it's a weird feature of the theory. But that just turns out to be the case, that if hedonism is true, you shouldn't, if pleasure is the only good, you shouldn't pursue pleasure. So this is just something hedonists will say in response to this objection. They'll say, yeah, hedonism is true, and therefore you shouldn't pursue pleasure. You should actually, pour into your friends. And don't like evaluate it at the end of the day and say, well, I poured into them, but it didn't really make me happy. No, you actually have to take it as an end in itself. Your friend's good, your children's good, winning the game, whatever. When you're doing, think of your hobbies, right? Or some like art form. I'm thinking about like remodeling this house that I've done, and it gets to be like a creative endeavor that you're engaged in. But I'm not sitting there as I, do the countertops or redo the windowsill or something. And I'm not thinking, wow, this is really making me happy. No, my mind is really not focused in on itself at all. It's focused on that windowsill. And I'm thinking, wow, this is really gorgeous. And then in retrospect, I'll say, wow, that was a good time. This is, I think, part of the explanation for why we have nostalgia, right? We're looking back on something and we're saying, why didn't I appreciate that? That was such a good time. And the reason is because we were focused on something else, and that's why we were having such a good time.